April 15, 1943. 27,000 feet above the Pas-de-Calais, where the air is so thin it burns your lungs like swallowing broken glass. Up here, at altitudes where human beings have no business existing, breathing feels like drowning in ice water. Your vision narrows. Your fingers go numb even inside leather gloves. Oberstleutnant Joseph Pips Priller, a legend with 3 years of continuous combat without a single day of leave and one of the Luftwaffe's most feared and decorated fighter wings, watches through the armored glass windscreen of his Focke-Wulf 190A4. American fighters climb toward him with what appears to be painful, almost comical slowness. Like watching freight elevators ascend while riding a high-speed lift. Their silhouettes, even at 5 miles distance, violate every principle he's internalized through 400 combat missions, through engagements from the Arctic Circle to North Africa, through dogfights that killed men whose names he still remembers at 3 in the morning when sleep won't come. Too broad across the wings. Too heavy in the fuselage. Those radial engines, massive, brutish things, look like bomber power plants grafted onto fighter airframes by engineers who fundamentally misunderstood what makes a fighter work. Everything about them screams wrong to a pilot whose survival has depended on understanding the geometry of aerial combat with mathematical precision. Priller has shot down Spitfires, graceful, deadly, responsive as fencing blades. He's killed Hurricanes, P-40 Warhawks, Soviet Yak-1s and Lag-3s. He knows what a proper fighter looks like. These American machines aren't it. 2 weeks later, after several more encounters with the lumbering Americans, after watching them struggle to keep formation, after observing their clumsy attempts to engage German fighters in turning combat, Priller reduces 12,500 pounds of American engineering, months of wind tunnel testing, millions of dollars in development costs, the concentrated effort of thousands of Republic aviation workers in Long Island, to a single dismissive phrase in his official assessment to Luftwaffe operations staff: easy prey below 7,000 meters. He files the report with the confidence of a man who has been proven right 400 times. The assessment circulates through Luftwaffe Fighter Command from Norway to the Mediterranean. Other pilots, men with comparable experience, with Knight's Crosses of their own, with victory tallies in the dozens, read it and nod in agreement. They've seen these American fighters too. Heavy, slow to climb, ponderous in turns. Everything wrong with American industrial thinking made physical. Overbuilt, over-engineered, optimized for factors that don't matter in real combat. The mathematics of Priller's confidence appear absolutely bulletproof. Simple physics, the kind they teach to every fighter pilot from the first week of training at Jagdfliegerschule. The new American P-47 Thunderbolt weighs 5,500 pounds more than his Focke-Wulf 190, a staggering 79% mass penalty. It's not just heavier. It's catastrophically heavier, carrying weight that serves no purpose except to slow it down, make it less agile, transform what should be a thoroughbred fighter into a lumbering cart horse. It climbs 900 feet per minute slower at sea level. A 40% deficit that means German fighters reach combat altitude while Americans are still struggling upward through the vulnerable middle altitudes where speed bleeds off, where engine performance suffers, where you're neither high enough to dive with energy advantage nor low enough to run for home. It's the worst place to be in a fighter, and American pilots spend minutes crawling through it while German fighters position overhead like hawks above mice. In turning combat below 20,000 feet, where most dogfights occur because that's where bombers fly, German fighters can outturn the P-47 by margins measured not in degrees but in complete circles. AFW 190 can loop inside a P-47's turn radius with room to spare. In a turning fight, the fundamental reality of air combat since 1914, the P-47 is beaten before the engagement starts. These aren't opinions. These aren't estimates. These are measurements, recorded numbers, empirical data that Priller and every experienced German pilot can feel in their hands through the control stick during combat. The Americans have built a fighter that loses every metric that matters. But embedded in Priller's calculus, hidden beneath layers of experience and successful tactics and victory credits that prove his understanding, lies a fatal blind spot. The kind of cognitive error that ends empires and loses wars, the kind that seems obvious only in hindsight but is invisible while you're living through it. He's measuring variables that mattered in 1939. Weight, climb rate, turn radius. The holy trinity of fighter performance that defined aerial supremacy from the cloth and wire biplanes of 1918 through the early war fighters of Poland and France. These are the measurements that elevated German fighter tactics to an art form, that produced aces with triple-digit victory scores like Erich Hartmann's 352 kills, that gave the Luftwaffe its mythology of invincibility, that made the Wehrmacht's ground advances possible. Weight equals agility. Climb rate equals positional advantage. Turn radius equals survival. For 5 years, from Spain through Poland through France through Britain through Russia, these equations have held true. They're written in the blood of thousands of enemy pilots who learned them too late. What Priller cannot see from his cockpit at 27,000 feet, what his 400 missions haven't taught him because the lessons haven't been written yet, what his Knight's Cross and his victory tally and his survival instinct haven't revealed, those metrics are already obsolete. The war is changing beneath him like continental plates shifting, and he's still navigating by old maps. What matters now, in this new phase of industrial warfare where factory production rates matter more than individual pilot skill, where replacement capacity determines outcomes more surely than tactical brilliance, kinetic energy in a dive. That accumulated mass he dismisses as a weakness becoming a weapon, transforming from liability into lethal advantage through the simple physics of gravitational acceleration. A heavy object falls faster, hits harder, carries more momentum that can be converted into altitude or speed or killing position. Structural endurance under damage. Redundancy and over-engineering defeating tactical elegance. 4 longerons instead of 3. Doubled control cables. Armor plate thick enough to stop cannon shells. Fuel tanks with self-sealing layers. Engine cylinders that keep firing even when 3 of 18 are shot to pieces. The ungainly robustness of a machine designed by engineers who understood that elegance means nothing if you're dead. And 8 Browning M2 machine guns. Each one a masterpiece of American industrial engineering, each one capable of firing 800 rounds per minute, all 8 synchronized to fire simultaneously, creating a combined rate of fire of 106 half-inch projectiles every single second into a convergence zone 6 feet wide at 300 yards. 106 rounds per second. Not 1 or 2 or 5 like German cannon doctrine. 106. Creating what American gunnery instructors will come to describe, with mathematical precision, as a probability cloud. A term borrowed from quantum physics that transforms air combat from a duel of precision marksmanship into a problem of statistical inevitability. You don't need to be a perfect shot when you're firing 106 rounds per second. You just need to be approximately correct, and mathematics handles the rest. 24 months after Priller files his assessment, after 18,000 more combat sorties, after watching the American formations grow from uncertain dozens to confident hundreds, after losing pilots whose names he knew, whose families he met at Luftwaffe social functions, whose wives he wrote letters to explaining how bravely their husbands died, he will sit across a scarred wooden table in a British interrogation facility from Allied intelligence officers and speak entirely different words that will be recorded in his service file and quoted in post-war analyses. The Thunderbolt is the finest fighter bomber produced by any nation in this war. Not the fastest, not the most maneuverable, not the highest climbing or the longest ranging. The finest, the most effective. The one that changed the mathematics of aerial combat so fundamentally that all the old rules, all the old tactics, all the accumulated wisdom of 5 years of warfare became suddenly, catastrophically obsolete. This is the technical, tactical, and deeply human story of how that transformation occurred. How American industrial logic, brute force engineering, mass production philosophy, overwhelming material superiority accepted as doctrine rather than apologized for, dismantled German tactical brilliance piece by piece, sortie by sortie, funeral by funeral. How synchronized firepower mathematics rewrote the fundamental physics of aerial combat in ways that made previous doctrine not just outdated but actively suicidal. And how the confident laughter of veteran German pilots, men who had conquered the skies of Europe from Warsaw to the gates of Moscow, men who wore Knight's Crosses and flew fighters with victory tallies painted on their tails, died in their throats as they discovered what industrial-age warfare actually meant when the factories were 3,000 miles away across an ocean and could produce aircraft faster than you could destroy them. June 1940. France, the great continental power with the largest army in Western Europe, collapses in 6 weeks. Not 6 months of grinding attrition. Not 6 years of total war. 6 weeks. 42 days from initial invasion to armistice. The Wehrmacht achieves what the Kaiser's armies failed to accomplish in 4 years and millions of casualties during the First World War. Military analysts worldwide are stunned into silence trying to understand how this happened, trying to reconcile their assumptions about European warfare with this new, terrifying reality. And overhead, establishing air superiority so complete that French and British forces operate in near total blindness, unable to conduct reconnaissance, unable to coordinate ground movements, unable even to understand where German forces are concentrating until panzer columns appear on the horizon, flies the Luftwaffe, demonstrating fighter dominance across an entire theater with a speed and thoroughness that fundamentally challenges everything military aviation theorists believed they understood about air power. The strategic implications reach across the Atlantic within days. Urgent telegrams, emergency meetings, War Department briefings where the atmosphere feels like the air before a thunderstorm. If Germany can achieve this level of air superiority, if their fighter force can so completely neutralize Allied air power that ground operations proceed almost uncontested, that armies maneuver in broad daylight without fear of air attack, that supply columns move on open roads in full view, then the United States, still officially neutral but watching with increasing alarm as Europe burns, faces a potential enemy with capabilities that exceed anything in the American inventory by margins that cannot be closed through incremental improvements. The U.S. Army Air Corps, still operating Curtiss P-36 Hawks that are already obsolete and early model P-40 Warhawks that are barely adequate, issues specification XE603 with unusual urgency, with language that betrays barely controlled panic in the usually conservative engineering requirements. Design a high-altitude interceptor capable of matching German performance above 25,000 feet. Not hope to match, or approximately equal to, or competitive with. Capable of matching. The requirement acknowledges a technological gap that must be closed and closed quickly, before that gap becomes unbridgeable. Alexander Kartveli receives the specification at Republic Aviation's facility in Farmingdale, Long Island, in his cluttered office that smells of cigarette smoke and drafting ink and the peculiar chemical odor of blueprint paper. 42 years old. Georgian émigré who fled the Russian Revolution with nothing but his engineering education and an accent he'll never completely lose. Chief designer with a growing reputation for unconventional solutions that work when conventional wisdom says they shouldn't. Graduate of the École supérieure d'aéronautique et de constructions mécaniques in Paris, where he absorbed both French aeronautical theory, elegant, mathematical, obsessed with efficiency, and practical engineering methods that prioritize what works over what's theoretically optimal. Kartveli studies the requirement with the methodical intensity of a chess grandmaster examining a difficult position. He chain-smokes lucky strikes. He fills yellow legal pads with calculations. He stares at the wall where cutaway diagrams of European fighters are pinned, Spitfire, Bf-109, Macchi C.200, all the successful designs that define contemporary fighter doctrine. And he recognizes, with the clarity that sometimes comes to engineers in moments of creative breakthrough, the fundamental choice confronting him, the same choice facing every fighter designer in 1940, but now made urgent and unavoidable by France's collapse and Britain's desperate struggle for survival. He can pursue the European model, the orthodoxy that has dominated fighter design since the First World War. Lightweight construction using minimum materials. Minimal armor because armor adds weight and weight kills performance. Engines optimized for climb rate and maneuverability rather than raw power. Armament kept as light as possible while still being effective, because every pound of guns and ammunition is a pound not available for fuel or performance. This is the philosophy that produced the Supermarine Spitfire with its elliptical wings and graceful lines, the Messerschmitt Bf-109 with its narrow track landing gear and cramped cockpit, the Macchi C.202 that Italian pilots call lightning for its responsiveness, elegant machines that fight like fencers, relying on pilot skill and aircraft agility and the principle that the best defense is not getting hit in the first place. Its beautiful aircraft design. It's produced the most successful fighters in the world. Every nation with a serious air force follows this philosophy. The data supports it. The combat records validate it. The experienced pilots demand it. Or he can break with orthodoxy entirely. Commit heresy. Build something heavier, tougher, more powerful, accepting that it will violate every aesthetic principle of fighter design. Accept performance penalties in some areas, turn radius, initial climb rate, wing loading, to gain overwhelming advantages in others. Design not for the air combat of 1940, where experienced pilots and nimble fighters duel like medieval knights, but for the air combat of 1943 and beyond, when the skies over Europe might contain not dozens but hundreds of fighters, when pilot experience might decline catastrophically as casualties mount and training programs struggle to replace losses, when the side that can absorb punishment and maintain operations will matter more than the side with the most elegant aerodynamics or the most skilled aces. Kartveli, working through calculations late into the night while his engineering team waits for direction, makes a choice that will eventually change the course of the air war. He chooses apostasy. He chooses to build something that will make test pilots file negative reports and procurement officers shake their heads and experienced fighter pilots complain bitterly about how it handles. He chooses to design an aircraft that looks wrong, feels wrong, violates every instinct about what makes a good fighter. He chooses to be right. The XP-47B prototype that first flies on May 6, 1941. Test pilot Lowry Brabham at the controls, Republic aviation engineers watching from the tarmac with a mixture of pride and anxiety that anyone who's ever built something revolutionary understands viscerally, weighs 9,900 pounds empty. No fuel. No ammunition. No pilot. No operational equipment. Just the airframe and the engine. The naked aircraft. 9,900 pounds. Let that number settle. That's 4,377 pounds heavier than a Messerschmitt Bf 109E4 in the same configuration. It's 2,180 pounds heavier than a Focke-Wulf 190A1. It's heavier than some twin-engine light bombers like the Bristol Blenheim. It weighs more empty than many fighters weigh fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and pilot. Test pilots at Wright Field, experienced aviators who have flown everything from nimble biplanes to experimental jets, men whose opinions carry weight in procurement decisions. File reports using words like elephantine, ponderous, truck-like flying a Greyhound bus. Their assessments are technically accurate. In level flight turning combat at medium altitudes, the performance regime where most air combat occurs, the XP-47B handles like a semi-trailer truck compared to the sports car responsiveness of German fighters. Roll rate is mediocre. Turn radius is measured in acres. Stick forces are heavy enough that prolonged maneuvering combat leaves pilots physically exhausted, arms aching from fighting the controls. But they're evaluating it against the wrong standard, measuring it with the wrong intellectual framework, judging it by criteria that made sense in 1939 but are becoming obsolete even as they write their reports. They're asking, is this a good dogfighter? When Kartveli has built something designed to make dogfighting obsolete, to transform air combat from artistic dueling into industrial process. Kartveli hasn't built a European fighter with American resources. He hasn't tried to copy the Spitfire or match the Bf 109 while adding American improvements. He's built something fundamentally different. An American fighter conceived from first principles around capabilities that will define industrial-age aerial warfare rather than capabilities that define the last war or even the current phase of this war. Survivability through structural redundancy and armor protection. Not minimal armor as compromise, but heavy armor as design philosophy. 3/8-inch face-hardened steel plate behind the pilot's seat, thick enough to stop 20mm cannon shells at 200 yards. Armor around the engine. Armored glass windscreen. Self-sealing fuel tanks with multiple layers. 4 main longerons instead of the standard 3, providing redundancy so the aircraft can sustain catastrophic damage to primary structures and keep flying. Control cables doubled and separated so a single hit can't sever all control authority. Lethality through sustained volume of fire rather than precision marksmanship. Not 2 cannon with limited ammunition, but 8 machine guns with 3,400 rounds total. Not 20 seconds of firing time but 32. Not the philosophy of skilled marksmen conserving ammunition, but the philosophy of industrial saturation where volume compensates for individual precision. Performance through brute force application of horsepower rather than aerodynamic refinement. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produces 2,000 horsepower, more than any single-engine fighter in production anywhere in the world. It's turbo-supercharged, maintaining sea-level manifold pressure up to 30,000 feet, meaning the aircraft actually gets more powerful as it climbs into altitudes where other fighters are gasping for air. Where a Bf 109's engine produces perhaps 700 horsepower at 25,000 feet, the P-47's R2800 still delivers nearly 2,000. This is American engineering philosophy made physical. If a problem can be solved by adding more power, add more power. If structure isn't strong enough, make it stronger. If ammunition capacity seems limited, double it. Elegance is European. Sufficiency is American. And in total war between industrial powers, sufficiency produced in overwhelming quantity defeats elegance every single time. To understand why the P-47's armament represented not just a technical difference but a philosophical revolution that would transform aerial combat doctrine, we must first understand what it replaced, and what it opposed across the battle lines. Standard Luftwaffe fighter doctrine in 1943, refined through 3 years of combat experience across multiple theaters from the North Cape to North Africa, from the Atlantic Wall to the Russian front. Mount the heaviest weapons the airframe can structurally carry without compromising flight characteristics. Maximize destructive power per hit. Compensate for limited ammunition capacity by training pilots to fire in short, precise bursts. Quality over quantity. Surgical strikes over saturation. The philosophy of the skilled craftsman, the master swordsman who makes every stroke count because he knows he cannot afford to waste effort. The logic is sound, internally consistent, validated by years of successful combat. Aviation fuel is rationed. Aluminum is scarce. Ammunition production faces constraints from raw material shortages and competing demands from other military branches. Cannon shells, especially 20mm and 30mm rounds, require significantly more raw materials and manufacturing time than machine gun bullets. The explosive fillers come from limited chemical production. The brass cases consume copper needed elsewhere. Every round fired represents resources that could have been used for something else. Therefore, use fewer, heavier weapons. Train pilots to exceptional standards so they need fewer rounds per kill. Accept that not every trigger pull results in an enemy aircraft destroyed, but when a kill occurs, it requires minimal ammunition expenditure. 5 rounds of 30mm cannon fire can destroy a heavy bomber. 10 rounds can down 3 fighters if the pilot is skilled enough. Economy of force becomes doctrine. Result: Focke-Wulf 190A5, the standard Luftwaffe fighter in mid-1943, the aircraft Priller and his contemporaries fly into combat, carries two 20mm MG-150-120 cannon mounted in the wing roots plus two 13mm MG-131 machine guns mounted above the engine cowling in a synchronized arrangement that fires through the propeller arc. Total ammunition capacity: 250 rounds of 20mm, 125 rounds per gun, and 900 rounds of 13mm, 450 rounds per gun. Combined firing duration: approximately 20 seconds of continuous fire before the cannon, the primary weapon, the killing weapon, exhausts its ammunition completely. Some variants carry even heavier armament configurations: 4 20mm cannon distributed between wing roots and outboard wing positions, or 2 20mm plus 2 30mm 108 Malawian Quachas cannon for specialized bomber-destroyer roles, but with correspondingly reduced ammunition capacity and increased weight penalties that degrade performance further. 1 20mm Minengeskus, mine shell, a German innovation featuring thin wall casing to maximize explosive content rather than structural strength, carries approximately 18 grams of PTN/TNT explosive mixture. It's a beautiful piece of ammunition engineering, optimized for maximum destructive effect. Upon detonation inside an aircraft structure, it can sever control cables like scissors through thread, crack wing spars like breaking matchsticks, ignite fuel tanks despite self-sealing compounds, or kill the pilot through overpressure and fragmentation even without direct hit. A single well-placed hit, and German pilots train endlessly to achieve well-placed hits, can transform a flying aircraft into falling debris within seconds. Gun camera footage from successful engagements shows it repeatedly. One flash, structural failure, aircraft departing controlled flight immediately. German fighter pilots, consequently, learn to fire with extreme discipline that borders on miserliness. Watch gun camera footage from Luftwaffe kills, the footage that survives the war, that isn't destroyed in the chaos of defeat, that makes it into Allied intelligence archives. Brief trigger pulls, rarely exceeding 2 seconds. 3 at absolute maximum for particularly difficult deflection shots. Fire, observe impacts, fire again if needed, disengage if the enemy is clearly destroyed. Ammunition discipline becomes survival doctrine because running dry in the middle of a combat engagement means you've just transformed from hunter to hunted, from deadly to helpless, from fighter pilot to target. Experienced German pilots become extraordinarily skilled at ammunition management. They learn to judge range to within 20 meters by visual estimation. They develop instinctive sense of deflection angles based on target aspect and closure rate. They practice for hundreds of hours on ground ranges, on training missions, developing the muscle memory that lets them fire precisely during combat stress when rational thought becomes impossible and only trained reflex saves you. It's beautiful flying. It's skillful marksmanship. It's the kind of aerial combat that produces aces with double-digit and triple-digit victory scores, that creates mythology about fighter pilots as knights of the air. It's everything that made the Luftwaffe fearsome from 1939 through 1942. The American philosophy inverts this equation, and in doing so, challenges assumptions about air combat that had held constant since the First World War, since the days when machine guns were first mounted on aircraft and men discovered that aerial combat meant something very different from anything that had come before. P-47C armament specification: 8 Browning and M250 caliber machine guns. 4 per wing, mounted in 2 closely spaced pairs outboard of the main landing gear wells, positioned to concentrate fire at the design convergence point. Each gun fed by a dedicated 425-round ammunition box positioned in the wing bay, accessible for ground crew reloading, designed for quick turnaround between missions. Total capacity, 3,400 rounds. Not 3,400 rounds total to be distributed among weapons according to pilot preference or mission requirements. 3,400 rounds of the same caliber, the same ballistic characteristics, the same trajectory, feeding 8 identical guns that fire with the same cyclic rate and create 8 parallel streams of destruction that converge at the designated range. Combined cyclic rate, 6,400 rounds per minute. That translates to 106 rounds leaving the aircraft every single second, 106 half-inch projectiles each carrying kinetic energy and incendiary compound and armor-piercing capability. Duration of continuous fire, 31.9 seconds. Round it to 32 seconds for practical purposes. Pause to let that number settle into your understanding. 32 seconds of sustained, continuous fire. In air combat, where engagements typically last between 30 seconds and 2 minutes from initial visual contact to either decisive resolution or mutual disengagement, where the brief moments when you have a firing solution might last only 3 or 4 seconds before the target maneuvers out of your sights or your own aircraft's motion spoils the geometry. An American pilot can theoretically hold the trigger down for the entire fight from beginning to end and still have ammunition remaining. German pilots must manage their ammunition like a miser counting coins in a depression, constantly aware that every trigger pull brings them closer to helplessness. American pilots can afford to be profligate, to fire long bursts, to saturate areas of sky with metal rather than precisely targeting specific points, to keep the trigger depressed and let mathematics handle the killing. But the philosophical divergence goes deeper than simple ammunition count, deeper than the obvious observation that 32 seconds exceeds 20 seconds. It represents fundamentally different assumptions about what air combat is and how you win it. German doctrine prioritizes precision, the skilled marksman who conserves limited cannon ammunition and achieves kills with minimum expenditure, who treats each trigger pull as a conscious decision requiring judgment and expertise. It's an artisan's approach to air combat, quality of craftsmanship, precision of execution, economy of means. The fighter pilot as surgeon, making careful incisions with expensive instruments, understanding that wasted resources represent actual material cost and strategic disadvantage. American doctrine prioritizes probability, creating a lethal environment so dense with kinetic energy, so saturated with projectiles, that approximate aim becomes sufficient and perfect precision becomes unnecessary. You don't need surgical precision when you're firing 106 rounds per second into a convergence zone 6 feet wide at 300 yards. You need to be approximately correct. Point the nose roughly at the target, hold it steady enough that the convergence zone overlaps some portion of the enemy aircraft, squeeze the trigger and maintain pressure while mathematics does the killing. It's an industrial approach to air combat. Mass production of fire, statistical probability of hits, overwhelming volume compensating for individual imprecision. Every fighter aircraft with wing-mounted guns, whether American, German, British, Soviet, Japanese, Italian, or any nation that fields military aviation, faces the same geometric challenge imposed by basic physics and aircraft design requirements. Guns positioned in the wings, separated by several feet because that's where structural strength exists and where mounting hardware can be installed without compromising the fuselage for cockpit and engine, firing parallel to each other along paths determined by bore sighting during ground installation, will never naturally concentrate their fire on a single point. The bullet streams will remain forever separated by the same distance that separates the guns themselves, reducing hit probability and dispersing damage across wider areas of the target aircraft, often causing multiple non-lethal hits rather than concentrated lethal damage. The solution, understood since the First World War but refined to high art by the Second. Convergence. Bore sight each gun to aim inward by a precise angle so that all bullet streams cross at a specific distance from the aircraft. At that distance, and only at that distance, maximum lethality occurs as all streams intersect in a small area where kinetic energy density reaches maximum concentration. Closer or farther than optimal convergence range, the streams begin diverging again as simple geometry dictates, though they remain more concentrated than if they were firing parallel. AF Manual 50-8, the doctrinal Bible for American fighter gunnery that every pilot studies during training, the document that represents accumulated understanding from thousands of combat engagements and hundreds of thousands of rounds fired in anger, recommends 250 to 300 yards for 50 caliber machine gun armament on fighter aircraft. The recommendation comes from empirical testing, from measuring hit probability at various ranges, from analyzing gun camera footage and combat reports. At 300 yards, 900 feet, 3 football fields, close enough to see details of the target aircraft's markings but far enough that the target has time to maneuver if the pilot sees you coming, all 8 ballistic trajectories from a P-47's guns cross inside a circle approximately 6 feet in diameter. For context and comparison, that's smaller than the wingspan of a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 at 32 feet 6 inches. Smaller than a Focke-Wulf 190's fuselage length at 29 feet. Smaller than the vertical stabilizer height on most contemporary fighters. It's a tight pattern, a concentrated kill zone, an area of such high projectile density that anything inside it suffers catastrophic damage in seconds. Now we must acknowledge the gulf between theoretical gunnery, calculations done on paper, tests conducted on ground ranges where targets don't maneuver and shooters aren't under stress, and combat reality, where nothing goes according to plan and perfect is the enemy of adequate. Air combat doesn't occur at perfect convergence distance with obliging targets holding still while you line up the shot. Pilots estimate range visually using only their eyes and experience, without rangefinders or laser guidance or any technological assistance. And visual range estimation under combat stress, in three-dimensional space where depth perception is inherently unreliable, with a target maneuvering unpredictably and your own aircraft maneuvering to maintain position, is notoriously inaccurate even among experienced aviators. Studies of gun camera footage, meticulous frame-by-frame analysis of thousands of combat engagements, show pilots typically misjudge range by 50 to 100 yards either direction. Sometimes more. Sometimes you think you're at 300 yards and you're actually at 400. Sometimes you think you're at 400 and you're actually at 250 and about to collide. Deflection angles constantly shift as both attacker and target maneuver through three-dimensional space. The perfect no-deflection tail shot, where you're directly behind the enemy aircraft, flying the same direction, matching his speed exactly, with no angular motion between you, rarely occurs outside training scenarios and gunnery demonstrations. Most firing solutions involve deflection. You must aim not at where the target is right now, but where it will be when your bullets arrive 0.3 to 0.5 seconds later, accounting for bullet travel time, for the target's motion, for your own motion, for wind if you're low enough for it to matter, for every variable that transforms simple marksmanship into complex three-dimensional calculus that must be solved instinctively in fractions of seconds. Targets don't cooperate by flying straight and level like aerial targets on practice ranges. They jink, sudden sharp movements left and right. They break, violent turns intended to defeat firing solutions. They dive, climb, roll, skid, execute any maneuver that might spoil your aim or force you to overshoot or create separation long enough for them to escape or reverse the engagement. Enemy pilots want to live just as desperately as you do, and they'll sacrifice speed, altitude, position, anything to avoid being in your gun sight when you squeeze the trigger. Real-world firing solutions, therefore, contain error. Sometimes minor error that slightly reduces hit probability. Sometimes significant error that turns a potentially lethal burst into rounds passing harmlessly past the target. Combat isn't like gunnery school. Combat is chaos with wings. German cannon armament, whether two 20mm weapons mounted in the wing roots as on standard FW-190 fighters, or four 20mm distributed in a mix of fuselage and wing positions as on bomber-destroyer variants, or the heavier configurations with 30mm 108 Malawian Quachas cannon that can destroy four-engine bombers with single hits, creates multiple impact points separated by several feet at convergence range. On an FW-190A5, the wing root cannon are spaced approximately 6 feet apart, far enough that convergence geometry matters enormously. Fire at perfect convergence range with perfect deflection and your cannon shells bracket the target beautifully, impacting on opposite sides of fuselage or wing, often causing lethal structural damage. But introduce 50 yards of range error, an easy mistake in combat, nearly inevitable under stress, and your cannon shells impact 4 or 5 feet apart, separated enough that hitting the target with one weapon often means missing completely with the other. Fire from too close and the streams haven't converged yet. Fire from too far and they've diverged again. To achieve concentrated lethal damage that destroys the target immediately rather than just damaging it enough that it might eventually crash, the German pilot must execute a nearly perfect firing solution. Correct range within 20 meters, correct deflection within 2 degrees, correct timing, correct lead angle, everything aligned in a brief moment of geometric perfection. 3 feet of ranging error or 2 degrees of deflection error can mean the difference between a catastrophic hit that ends the engagement immediately and a clean miss that wastes precious ammunition and gives the target opportunity to escape or counterattack. The P-47's 8-gun pattern creates what American gunnery instructors describe with scientific precision as a probability cloud, a term borrowed from mathematics and physics, from quantum mechanics and statistical analysis, that captures something fundamental about how the weapon system actually works. 3 feet of ranging error? 2 degrees of deflection error? Range estimate off by 50 yards? The convergence point shifts slightly, the pattern spreads marginally, but 106 rounds per second still impact the target in a concentrated, lethal cluster because the pattern is large enough and dense enough to accommodate normal human error. The probability cloud is large enough, dense enough, mathematically robust enough, that errors in the firing solution degrade lethality but don't eliminate it. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be close enough. 9 Fighter Command Armament Analysis from February 1944, based on meticulous review of actual gun camera footage and verification of kills through intelligence reports and German loss records, demonstrates that 50 caliber batteries achieve higher hit probability per engagement and higher confirmed kill percentage despite lower destructive power per individual round compared to cannon armament. The data is unambiguous. Primary factors. Convergence geometry creates tighter concentration of impacts relative to target size. Ammunition capacity permits longer trigger time, increasing hits per engagement by allowing pilots to maintain fire through target maneuvers rather than having to achieve perfect solution in brief window. Higher rate of fire creates denser probability cloud where even marginal firing solutions produce hits. Lower recoil. 50 caliber machine guns produce significantly less recoil than 20mm or 30mm cannon. Permits more accurate sustained fire because the aircraft doesn't buck and yaw with each shot, allowing the pilot to maintain aim throughout the burst. Conclusion supported by data. In air-to-air combat between fighters, the pilot who can fire longer and hit more consistently defeats the pilot with heavier individual hits but limited ammunition capacity and constrained firing duration. Volume defeats precision when volume reaches sufficient density. The German pilot practices marksmanship, artistry, the careful application of limited resources. The American pilot practices saturation, industrialization, the overwhelming application of abundant resources. One philosophy assumes scarcity. The other assumes abundance. And in total war between industrial powers, the assumption of abundance proves correct. April 8, 1943. RAF Station Debden, Essex, England. Early morning, cold enough that ground crews' breath steams in the pre-dawn air as they service aircraft in the dispersal areas, as they load ammunition belts and top off fuel tanks and check oil levels with numbed fingers. The kind of cold that makes metal tools stick to bare skin if you're foolish enough to grab them without gloves. The 4th Fighter Group, formerly the RAF's Eagle Squadrons, American volunteers who flew Supermarine Spitfire Mk versus in combat before Pearl Harbor brought their nation officially into the war, men who chose to fight when they didn't have to, who crossed the Atlantic to join a war their country was still debating, prepares for the P-47 Thunderbolt's first major escort mission over occupied Europe. These are not inexperienced pilots learning combat for the first time. They're combat veterans with combat ribbons and combat decorations and the particular alertness in the eyes that separates men who have survived combat from men who have only trained for it. Men like Don Blakesley, who already has credits for German aircraft destroyed, whose name German intelligence knows, who has survived engagements that killed pilots with more apparent skill. Howard Deacon Hively, who has flown operational sorties against the Luftwaffe over France and the Low Countries, who knows what 20mm cannon strikes sound like when they hit near you. Pilots who understand energy tactics and deflection shooting and formation discipline and the deadly choreography of multi-aircraft engagements where one mistake, one moment of inattention, one failure to check 6 o'clock means you never see the burst that kills you. But they're transitioning to an aircraft that violates every instinct they've developed in Spitfires, every reflex they've trained, every assumption about how a fighter should respond to control inputs. The Spitfire Mk-V, with its elliptical wings that have become iconic, its Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that sounds like civilization itself, roughly 6,700 pounds loaded for combat, responds to control inputs like an extension of the pilot's intentions, like the aircraft can read your mind and moves before you complete the thought. Light stick forces that feel like power steering. Crisp roll rate that lets you reverse direction in seconds. Turn radius tight enough that you can loop inside a German fighter's turn if you time it correctly, if you judge the energy states properly, if you execute with precision. The P-47, 14,500 pounds loaded for combat, more than double the Spitfire's weight, twice as much mass to accelerate and decelerate and maneuver through the sky, responds like something else entirely, like something from a different category of aircraft, like the engineers designed it for a different war. Stick forces are heavier, requiring real physical pressure to move the controls, leaving pilots' arms aching after extended combat. Roll rate is ponderous by comparison, measured in long seconds rather than quick snaps. Turning radius is measured in acres rather than square meters, requiring vast amounts of sky to complete what a Spitfire does in tight spaces. Everything happens more slowly, requiring more advanced planning, more anticipation, leaving less margin for error when the geometry goes wrong. Mission result, filed that evening in terse military language that doesn't capture the frustration and confusion and dawning horror. 0 enemy aircraft destroyed. 2 P-47s damaged by German fighters during a brief engagement that sees the Americans attempting to turn with Focke-Wulf 190s, exactly the wrong tactic, like trying to beat a sports car in a drag race while driving a truck. Pilot reports describe the aircraft as unresponsive below 20,000 feet and unable to sustain turning engagements against German types. Some reports are more blunt. This aircraft cannot dogfight. We will all die if we continue operating this aircraft in its current role. April through May 1943, combined statistics across all P-47 units operating from England, numbers that tell a story of blood and confusion and tactical doctrine colliding with mechanical reality. 1,156 sorties flown into hostile airspace, into skies controlled by the Luftwaffe, into air where German fighters operate with the confidence of ownership. 3 enemy aircraft claimed destroyed, and even these claims will be disputed by post-war analysis when German loss records are examined and some claimed victories can't be matched to actual German losses. 14 P-47s lost to enemy action, shot down by German fighters who understand the engagement geometry better, who exploit every P-47 weakness with practiced efficiency. 3 more lost to accidents, mechanical failures, pilot error, weather, the routine attrition of operating complex machinery in hostile conditions. Another 11 damaged beyond economical repair, written off as total losses even though the pilots survived. Kill-loss ratio, 0.21 to 1. For every German fighter destroyed, American forces lose 5 P-47s. 5 American pilots killed or captured or badly injured for every German pilot killed. 5 families receiving telegrams for every 1 German family receiving notification. 5 funerals for every 1 German funeral. The mathematics of attrition warfare when the mathematics work against you. Those numbers represent more than aircraft statistics in logistics reports. Each loss is a pilot, a man who survived perhaps 400 hours of training, who mastered takeoffs and landings and formation flying and instrument procedures and gunnery and navigation, who crossed the Atlantic on a troopship or flew the northern ferry route through Greenland and Iceland, who wrote letters home assuring mother or wife or girlfriend that he'd be careful, that the training was good, that the aircraft was solid, that he'd come home when this was over. Some bail out successfully and become prisoners of war, spending the next 2 years in Stalag Luft camps playing cards and waiting. Some don't bail out at all, killed by cannon fire or trapped in burning aircraft, or unconscious from head injuries, or unable to escape jammed canopies before the aircraft impacts ground at terminal velocity. The Royal Air Force's Air Fighting Development Unit, the elite test organization at RAF Wittering responsible for evaluating new aircraft and developing combat tactics, staffed with the best pilots and the most experienced tacticians, issues Assessment Report 47A on June 3, 1943, a document that circulates through Allied Air Command and causes urgent meetings in Washington. The evaluation is diplomatically phrased with the careful language of official military reports, but devastating in substance for anyone who reads between the lines. The Republic P-47C is unsuitable for defensive fighter operations due to poor climb performance below 20,000 feet and excessive wing loading that degrades turning performance across the operational envelope. Performance advantages above 25,000 feet are offset by critical vulnerabilities at operationally relevant altitudes where the majority of air combat occurs. Recommend retention and training role or specialized high-altitude interception duties only. Translation that every pilot understands immediately. The Americans have built a fighter that doesn't fight. Keep it away from combat before more pilots die learning what we already know. German intelligence assesses the new American aircraft with the clinical precision and methodical thoroughness that characterizes German military analysis, with a systematic approach that has made German intelligence services among the most effective in the world. Reports from frontline fighter units flow to Luftwaffe Führungsstab, to intelligence officers who compile data and assess trends and brief senior commanders. Classification: Geringe Bedrohung. Low threat. Not no threat. German intelligence is too professional to dismiss any Allied aircraft completely, but low threat, minimal concern, not requiring major tactical adjustments or resource reallocation. Assessment continues with analysis that pilots in combat wings find reassuring. Specialized high-altitude type with limited tactical flexibility. Vulnerable below 7,000 meters where majority of air combat occurs. Heavy wing loading and poor climb rate provide exploitable weaknesses. Recommends standard rot tactics. Attack from below, forcing target into turning engagement where performance disadvantage becomes decisive. Disengage vertically using superior climb rate. It's a playbook for killing P-47s and it works. German pilots read the intelligence summaries and nod. They've fought these American machines. They've seen how slowly they climb, how ponderously they turn. The intelligence confirms what combat experience teaches. Priller's May 15th assessment, easy prey below 7,000 meters, reflects consensus across Luftwaffe fighter command from Norway to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic Wall to the Russian front. The Americans have fielded an aircraft that plays to every German tactical strength, that allows German pilots to dictate engagement geometry, that can be defeated by applying doctrine that's been successful for years. The Germans have every reason for confidence. The data supports their analysis. The combat results validate their tactics. The kill-loss ratios prove they're right. But 3 incidents between June and August 1943 begin fracturing that comfortable certainty, each one revealing a different aspect of the P-47's true nature, like photographs of an elephant taken from different angles, slowly resolving into complete understanding of something larger and more dangerous than preliminary assessment suggested. Second Lieutenant Robert Samuel Johnson, 22 years old, which seems impossibly young for what he's about to experience but is actually old for a second lieutenant fighter pilot in 1943 when many are 19 or 20. Born in Lawton, Oklahoma during the Depression, where his father worked as a farmer and every meal required effort and nothing came easily. Enlisted in the Army Air Corps in November 1941, weeks before Pearl Harbor, before anyone knew for certain that America would be at war but when the signs were obvious to anyone paying attention. Completed basic flight training at one of the massive training facilities that America built in months, facilities that processed thousands of pilots where European nations processed dozens. Advanced flight training where he learned to handle high-performance aircraft. Gunnery school where he learned deflection shooting. P-47 transition training where he learned the aircraft's systems and limitations. 8 combat missions flown over occupied Europe. 0 victories credited to his record. He's still learning, still developing the instincts that separate pilots who survive from pilots who die in their first 10 missions. Mission briefing, morning of June 26th. Bomber escort to target in northern France. Simple navigation, established procedures, formations worked out through 7 previous missions. Nothing special. Routine escort, the kind they've done before, the kind they'll do tomorrow if they survive today. Johnson draws tail-end Charlie position in the squadron formation. The worst place to be, historically the position with highest loss rate because German fighters attack from behind and above, hitting the trailing aircraft first, killing the slowest or least alert or unluckiest before the formation even knows they're under attack. Mission proceeds nominally through takeoff, climb, channel crossing, penetration into French airspace. Radio chatter is minimal. Maintain radio discipline. Don't help German direction finders locate the formation. Below, occupied France looks peaceful from 24,000 feet, like nothing's wrong, like there isn't a war happening. You can't see the occupation from this altitude, can't see the checkpoints and the propaganda posters and the people living under foreign rule. 15:45 hours local time. Altitude 24,000 feet. The Channel coast is visible ahead, that blessed line between occupied territory and home, between danger and relative safety, between enemy airspace and friendly airspace. Safety is only 80 miles distant. 13 minutes at current ground speed. Less than a quarter hour from being over friendly territory where German fighters won't follow, where combat air patrol Spitfires will cover any stragglers, where damaged aircraft can make emergency landings at forward airfields. Then Focke-Wulf 190A5s from 2. Grupp, Jagerschwader 26, Priller's unit, though Priller himself isn't flying this mission, execute what German tactical doctrine calls a Schwarm bounce. Coordinated attack by multiple fighters from above and astern, each pilot selecting a target before the attack begins, attack angles calculated to maximize concentration of fire while minimizing American defensive response. The kind of precisely executed tactical maneuver that German fighter wings have practiced until it's instinctive, until they can execute it without radio coordination, each pilot knowing his role and his position and his responsibilities. Johnson's P-47, serial number 41 to 6235, Squadron Code LMS, painted on the fuselage in letters big enough to see from hundreds of yards, carrying 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and 305 gallons of fuel, absorbs fire from at least 3 attacking Focke-Wulfs simultaneously. Multiple German pilots firing at the same target, coordinating their attacks to maintain constant fire from different angles, textbook execution of numerical advantage. His memoir, published 15 years later in 1958 when memory has processed trauma into narrative and he can write about it without his hands shaking, describes the sequence with remarkable clarity that suggests he remembers every detail, that some experiences are so intense they burn into memory permanently. Cannon strikes to engine cowling, explosive impacts that tear away aluminum panels like paper and damage the power section and send shrapnel through cooling fins and cylinder heads. Right wing root, the structural zone where wing meets fuselage, the critical load-bearing area that carries flight loads and landing loads and everything that keeps the wing attached. Canopy frame, the steel tubing that supports the plexiglass enclosure and provides rollover protection. The canopy itself shatters under 20 mm impact, spraying fragments of plexiglass into the cockpit, some pieces embedding in his leather jacket, some cutting his face and hands. The canopy rail distorts from a direct hit, metal bending and jamming the sliding mechanism. Johnson reaches up with his right hand while holding the stick with his left and tries to slide the canopy back. Standard bailout procedure: open canopy first, then release seat belt, then push yourself out against the wind, and discovers with horror that it's jammed solid, won't move, will not open. Hydraulic fluid, red-colored synthetic oil, pressurized to 1000 psi in the aircraft's hydraulic system, sprays across the instrument panel as a hydraulic line severs somewhere in the firewall. The fluid is hot, nearly boiling from system pressure, and it covers the instruments and makes the gauges unreadable and fills the cockpit with that distinctive hydraulic fluid smell that's somewhere between burnt rubber and industrial solvent. Oil pressure gauge, normally reading steady at 80 psi, starts dropping as engine oil leaks from damaged lines. 70, 60, 50, 40. The windscreen, already oil smeared from normal engine operation, from the slight seepage that all radial engines produce, goes completely opaque as severed oil lines pump engine lubricant directly across the exterior glass. He's effectively blind forward, can't see through the windscreen at all, is navigating by instruments and by looking out the shattered side panels where fragments of canopy remain. He's trapped in a crippled aircraft at 24,000 feet with German fighters still attacking, still making passes, still pumping rounds into his aircraft. The rational decision: bail out, pull the ripcord at reasonable altitude, accept POW status, survive the war in a camp, go home when it's over, is physically impossible because the canopy won't open, and without the canopy opening he can't get out. He's locked inside a machine that's absorbing catastrophic damage with no way to escape. What happens next contradicts every assumption about combat damage tolerance that military engineers have internalized from 4 years of combat data across all theaters, from hundreds of thousands of combat sorties, from detailed examination of shot-down aircraft and pilot reports and intelligence assessments. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 radial rows of 9 cylinders each cylinder an independent combustion chamber with its own intake valve and exhaust valve and spark plug, air-cooled using airflow over cooling fins rather than liquid coolant circulating through passages, total displacement 2,804 cubic inches, weighing 2,300 pounds dry, continues producing power. Not full power. Probably not even half power. Perhaps 1,200 horsepower instead of the rated 2,000. But power. Thrust. Forward motion. The propeller keeps turning. The aircraft keeps flying. 3 cylinders are damaged, cylinder walls cracked by cannon shell fragments, pistons seized in their bores, valves jammed or broken, pushrods bent. But 15 cylinders keep firing. Each combustion cycle, each power stroke where gasoline and air ignite and expand and push the piston down and turn the crankshaft, continues driving the engine. 750 combustion events per minute across 15 functional cylinders. The propeller keeps turning at 2,400 RPM. The aircraft keeps moving forward at approximately 220 miles per hour. This shouldn't be possible according to standard engineering analysis. The vibration from damaged cylinders should shake the engine apart. The lost cooling should cause temperatures to climb until everything fails. The asymmetric power should create torque imbalances that tear the engine from its mounts. But the R2800 was designed with redundancy, with robustness, with the assumption that combat damage would occur and the engine needed to keep running anyway. American engineers built it oversized, overstrength, with safety margins that seem excessive until moments like this when the safety margins become survival margins. Johnson cannot see forward. The windscreen is completely opaque with oil. He navigates by instruments, by compass heading and artificial horizon and airspeed indicator, and by peripheral vision through the shattered side panels where he can see pieces of wing and pieces of sky and nothing else. He cannot maneuver aggressively. The control cables are damaged, hydraulics are failing, the aircraft responds sluggishly to control inputs. But he can maintain altitude. Keep the wings roughly level. Point the nose toward England using compass heading and dead reckoning. The English Channel is 80 miles ahead. Keep flying. Keep the engine running. Get home. An FW-190 follows him across the channel. One aircraft. One pilot. Identity never conclusively established. German combat reports from 2/JG-26 that day list several pilots who engaged P-47s, but none specifically claim this extended engagement with a damaged American fighter that refused to die. Perhaps the pilot didn't report it because destroying a damaged aircraft isn't worth claiming. Perhaps he didn't report it because what happened next confused him so badly he didn't know how to explain it in an official report. The German pilot positions astern, textbook firing position, the classic 6 o'clock where the target can't see you coming and can't return fire and where deflection angles are minimal. At range approximately 200 meters, close enough for certain hit probability. And opens fire with his complete remaining armament. 2 20mm MG 150-120 cannon, 2 13mm MG 131 machine guns, everything the FW-190 carries, all weapons firing simultaneously. Johnson, unable to evade because his aircraft won't respond to aggressive maneuvering, unable to return fire because engaging would require turning to bring guns to bear and he can barely keep the aircraft flying straight, huddles behind the armor plate. 3/8-inch face-hardened steel position directly behind the pilot's seat, designed specifically for this exact scenario, designed to stop cannon shells from astern where most attacks occur. The P-47 absorbs the fire. Armor plate stops cannon shells that would otherwise penetrate the pilot's seat and the pilot's body, stops them cold through metallurgy and thickness and hardness. Structural members, longerons and formers and stringers, the skeleton that holds the aircraft together, absorb hits and crack and deform but don't fail completely because there's redundancy, because there are 4 longerons instead of 3 because control cables are doubled and separated. The engine takes additional hits, more damage to already damaged cylinders, more punctures in already leaking oil lines, and keeps running because 15 cylinders are enough, because the R-2800 was built to survive this. The German empties his cannon, approximately 80 to 100 rounds remaining after the initial bounce and earlier engagements during the mission. 20mm cannon drums spin through their remaining ammunition and go empty. Click. Nothing. The cannon are dry. He repositions, closes to 100 meters where accuracy is nearly perfect, and fires his 13mm machine guns, perhaps 200 rounds remaining in each gun, 400 rounds total of smaller caliber ammunition that's less destructive per round but still lethal. Still the P-47 flies. Still it maintains altitude. Still it proceeds toward England at 220 miles per hour. The German must be experiencing cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable mental state when reality contradicts belief. His doctrine says this aircraft should be destroyed. His experience says aircraft don't absorb this much damage. His ammunition is nearly exhausted and the target is still flying. The German pilot pulls alongside, 30 feet of separation, close enough that Johnson can see his face clearly through both men's canopy glass despite his damaged vision, close enough to see details of expression and age and probably fear. Young. Maybe 23 or 24. Blonde hair visible under his flying helmet. Expression that Johnson will later describe as shifting visibly from confidence to confusion to something like fear or disbelief or dawning horror at what this means, at what it implies about the rest of the war if American aircraft can absorb this kind of punishment. The German gives a salute. A formal gesture, right hand raised to forehead in proper military fashion. Whether it's respect for Johnson's survival or amazement at the aircraft's endurance, or acknowledgement that he's out of ammunition and must disengage and cannot finish the kill, Johnson never knows, will never know, will spend the rest of his life wondering what that German pilot was thinking in that moment. The FW-190 turns away, banks left, descends toward France, leaving Johnson alone over the channel. Johnson crosses the channel. 80 miles of water where any emergency landing means death because the water temperature in June is still cold enough to kill in minutes, because survival time in the channel even with life vest is measured in tens of minutes before hypothermia takes you. The engine's vibration increases with each passing minute. Damaged cylinders creating imbalance in the rotating assembly, bearings failing from oil starvation, everything wearing faster than design specifications ever anticipated. Oil pressure drops to 20 psi, then 15, barely enough to provide lubrication. The aircraft rattles and shakes like a threshing machine running with broken parts, like a car with bent crankshaft, like nothing that should still be operating. He reaches the English coast. That blessed green line of Kent appearing through the oil-smeared windscreen fragments, through his side vision. Lad. Safety. Life. He identifies RAF Manston, emergency airfield on the Kent coast specifically set up for damaged aircraft, with long runway and crash equipment positioned and medical personnel standing by. Lowers the landing gear using the emergency extension system because hydraulics are gone. The gear drops and locks with reassuring mechanical clunks that mean at least one system still works. Hydraulic pressure indicators show asymmetric deployment, left main gear showing locked but right main gear showing questionable, but he doesn't care anymore because any landing he can walk away from is a good landing. The P-47 touches down on Manston's runway. Hard landing, bouncing once because he can't judge the flare properly without forward visibility, but the gear holds and the aircraft stays on the runway centerline and rolls out. Engine fails as the aircraft slows below 50 miles per hour. Complete loss of power. The propeller windmills briefly from momentum, then stops. He shuts down electrical systems following the emergency checklist from memory, then sits in the cockpit for several minutes, hands shaking too badly to unbuckle his seat belt, breathing hard through his oxygen mask because he's still at altitude mentality even though he's on the ground, alive. RAF ground crew approaches the aircraft with the mixture of professional curiosity and frank disbelief that technical people feel when something survives conditions that should have destroyed it. They begin damage assessment using standard forms. Count hits by type, classify impacts by caliber, assess structural integrity using visual inspection and measurements, determine whether aircraft is reparable or should be written off. They start counting methodically. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 50. They stop counting at 200 impacts because there are more than 200, because the aircraft is so damaged that exact count becomes meaningless, because what matters isn't the precise number but the fundamental fact that this aircraft absorbed catastrophic damage and flew home. Mix of 20mm cannon strikes, large holes with shredded metal petals radiating outward from the impact point, edges blackened from explosive filler, and 13mm machine gun hits. Smaller punctures, sometimes in lines where the German pilot walked his fire across the target, sometimes clustered where he held steady aim. Engineering report, filed by RAF technical officer using official forms and technical language that barely contains his amazement. 3 of 4 main longerons severed completely or cracked sufficiently to fail structural analysis testing. Aircraft should have experienced catastrophic structural failure during flight. Tail control cables 60% cut through by shell fragments. Only 40% of load-bearing cable strands intact, insufficient cross-section to meet safety margins for flight loads. 7 engine cylinders showing impact damage, through penetrations of cylinder barrels, damaged pistons visible through holes, miracle the engine continued operating. Propeller hub cracked in 2 locations, should have failed catastrophically causing loss of propeller which would have made aircraft uncontrollable. Wing main spar cracked at 2 locations near root, cracks extending through 40% of spar cap depth. Fuel cells punctured in multiple locations but self-sealing compound prevented total fuel loss that would have caused engine failure. Summary assessment in the official engineering language that will circulate to Wright Field and Republic Aviation and Air Ministry. Aircraft structural integrity maintained by aluminum skin panels alone after primary load-bearing structures failed, not by underlying framework as intended by design. Aircraft should not have remained airborne under established damage tolerance calculations based on existing fighter aircraft analysis. Strongly recommend comprehensive study of P-47 structural design and combat damage tolerance characteristics to understand failure mechanisms and survival characteristics. That final sentence, bureaucratic and understated, initiates a research program that will reshape fighter design philosophy for the remainder of the war and beyond, that will influence jet fighter design in the 1950s and 60s, that will establish new principles about structural redundancy and damage tolerance that persist into modern aircraft engineering. But on June 26, 1943, the immediate effect isn't bureaucratic or academic. It's psychological, and that effect propagates through both air forces like shock waves through water, invisible but powerful, changing calculations and assumptions and confidence levels in ways that are hard to quantify but impossible to ignore. American engineers at Wright Field and Republic Aviation Headquarters, receiving photographs and detailed damage reports via military courier and studying them with technical intensity, realize with dawning amazement that they've built something more survivable than their own conservative stress calculations predicted. The redundancy they designed into every system, 4 longerons instead of the standard 3 because they had weight budget and figured why not, doubled control cables because losing control authority means death so redundancy makes sense, armor specified to stop 20mm at 200 yards because German fighters carry 20mm cannon, structural members sized for 12G ultimate loads when combat typically doesn't exceed 6G because safety margins save lives. All these individual decisions made during design process, made somewhat arbitrarily by engineers applying conservative principles, compound and interact to create system-level survivability that exceeds the sum of its parts. Its emergence, the phenomenon where complex systems exhibit properties that individual components don't possess. The P-47 isn't just strong in one area. It's strong in every area simultaneously, and those strengths reinforce each other. Armor protects the pilot who can continue flying with damaged controls. Doubled control cables mean one severed cable doesn't mean loss of control. Multiple longerons mean catastrophic structural damage still leaves enough structure to fly. Engine redundancy means damaged cylinders don't mean complete power loss. Every system backs up every other system. German intelligence receives combat reports from 2/JG-26 within hours. Multiple pilots confirm. 1 P-47 absorbed concentrated fire from multiple fighters during initial coordinated bounce plus extended engagement from single pursuing aircraft, sustained damage that should have been catastrophic multiple times over, and escaped to return to England. Not just survive to crash land in the Channel or barely make it to friendly territory before crashing. Escape to fly home and land. Initial response from Luftwaffe intelligence analysts at Führungsstab. Disbelief and skepticism. The reports must be exaggerated. Combat stress distorts perception. Pilots under stress misjudge ranges, overestimate damage, see what they expect to see rather than what actually occurred. Standard intelligence analysis procedure demands skepticism of combat reports because pilots routinely claim 3 times more damage than they actually inflict. Perhaps the pilots overestimate the hits they achieved. Perhaps they fired fewer rounds than they believe. Perhaps the damage looked worse than it was. But testimony from multiple pilots, including experienced flight leaders with years of combat, corroborates the account in all essential details. Analysis of ammunition expenditure, counting rounds remaining in drums versus rounds loaded before mission, confirms the quantities fired. One pilot fired approximately 200 rounds of combined cannon and machine gun ammunition at single target at close range. Others fired shorter bursts during the initial bounce. Ballistics analysis indicates that at the ranges reported, hit probability should have been 60 to 80%. Mathematical modeling suggests the P-47 absorbed between 50 and 100 solid hits from 20mm and 13mm weapons. And it flew home. The Luftwaffe's comfortable assumption, that a sufficient quantity of cannon hits will disable any fighter aircraft regardless of type, suddenly contains an asterisk, a caveat, an exception that requires rethinking. The P-47 requires sustained fire to guarantee destruction. Not one pass with good hits. Sustained fire. Multiple passes. Ammunition expenditure that leaves the attacker vulnerable to other threats. And sustained fire means prolonged exposure to those 850 caliber machine guns that fire 106 rounds per second. The exchange ratio begins shifting, slowly at first, then accelerating like water beginning to boil. German pilots who previously attacked P-47s with confidence begin approaching with caution. The calculus changes. Attacking a P-47 now carries risk that it will survive your attack and return fire. The psychological effect amplifies the tactical effect. Lieutenant Colonel Hubert Zemke. 30 years old, which is ancient by fighter pilot standards where squadron commanders are usually 25 and many pilots are 19. Born in Missoula, Montana, raised in North Dakota during the Depression years when life was hard and nothing came easily. Regular Army officer, not a wartime volunteer but a career military professional. Fighter pilot by training and temperament and conscious choice. Commands the 56th Fighter Group, nicknamed Wolfpack for its planned aggressive tactics, with the kind of methodical intelligence and analytical thinking that separates adequate commanders from exceptional ones, that makes some officers effective administrators while others change the course of battles. Between April and June 1943, Zemke watches his unit lose 23 P-47s to enemy action with the particular horror that commanders feel when their decisions send men to death. Not mechanical failures that could be blamed on contractors or maintenance. not weather accidents that could be blamed on meteorology or luck. Enemy action, killed by German fighters who understand the engagement geometry better, who exploit every P-47 weakness with practiced efficiency, who shoot down Americans with the confidence of superior tactics applied against inferior aircraft. His pilots claim 11 German aircraft destroyed in the same period, though post-war analysis examining German loss records will reduce some of those claims because combat overclaiming is universal and claims don't always match losses. Kill-loss ratio, 0.48 to 1. Unsustainable. Catastrophic. At this rate, losing 23 aircraft every 10 weeks, the 56th Fighter Group will cease to exist as an effective combat unit within 4 months. The mathematics are brutal and unavoidable. You can't sustain operations when you lose aircraft twice as fast as you replace them, when pilots are dying faster than training commands can produce replacements. Zemke recognizes the problem with the clarity of someone who understands both tactics and mathematics. His pilots are fighting German tactics with an aircraft designed for fundamentally different combat physics. They're trying to turn with Focke-Wulf 190s. Impossible. The P-47 needs twice the radius and loses energy in turns and becomes vulnerable. They're trying to climb with Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Impossible. The German fighters gain 1,000 feet altitude advantage in the time the P-47 climbs 600 feet. They're trying to engage in sustained horizontal maneuvering combat where agility and turn rate matter most. Exactly the type of combat where German fighters excel and P-47s are fundamentally disadvantaged. They're fighting the wrong war with the wrong tactics in the wrong way. July 2, 1943. Zemke drafts Tactical Memorandum No. 12 in his office at Halesworth, working late into the night, revising and refining until the language is precise and unmistakable. Not suggestions for consideration. Not recommendations for evaluation. Directives. Orders. Commands that will be followed, or the pilots who don't follow them will face court-martial. Core Directive, Paragraph 3, typed in capital letters for emphasis. The P-47 will not engage in sustained turning combat at any altitude below 25,000 feet. This is not a recommendation or suggestion. This is a direct order. Pilots who violate this directive and survive will face disciplinary action, including possible court-martial for failure to obey orders. New tactical employment doctrine spelled out in detail. Maintain altitude superiority over enemy formations at all times. Minimum 5,000 feet above highest enemy aircraft observed. Execute diving attacks only. Dive from superior altitude at maximum speed. Fire during dive or at bottom of dive. Maximum trigger time per pass, 3 seconds to avoid excessive speed loss and maintain energy advantage. Disengage via vertical extension or continued dive. Do not, repeat, do not under any circumstances, attempt to follow enemy aircraft into horizontal maneuvering or turning combat. Pilots who attempt to turn with enemy fighters will be immediately removed from combat operations. The doctrine exploits what the P-47 actually does well rather than forcing it to compete in areas where it's fundamentally disadvantaged by physics and design. It accepts reality rather than fighting it. It works with the aircraft's nature rather than against it. Mass advantage, 14,500 pounds in combat configuration with pilot and fuel and ammunition. In physics, mass times velocity equals momentum. In a 45-degree dive from 30,000 feet, that enormous mass accelerates to terminal velocity limited only by airframe structural strength and compressibility effects approaching the speed of sound. The P-47 reaches 550 miles per hour indicated airspeed in a sustained dive, 807 feet per second, nearly 100 mph faster than any Luftwaffe production fighter can achieve even in pure vertical dives where German aircraft are theoretically fastest. Wars aren't won by the best weapons. They're won by adequate weapons in overwhelming quantity, supported by industrial capacity sustaining operations despite losses, employed by personnel trained to maximize actual capabilities. The P-47 succeeded because America fought an American war, industrial, material, sustained by manufacturing and training infrastructure absorbing catastrophic losses and continuing operations. German tactical brilliance, individual pilot skill, aerodynamic elegance proved insufficient against fundamental industrial advantage. 8 machine guns. 106 rounds per second. 32 seconds of fire. Backed by factories producing 15,659 P-47s. Training programs graduating thousands of pilots. That combination didn't just shoot down German fighters. It shattered the Luftwaffe's certainty that tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage. It demonstrated modern warfare favors the nation that sustains losses, replaces equipment, trains personnel, maintains operations indefinitely. The P-47 Thunderbolt stands as testament to industrial warfare's brutal mathematics. Not the weapon of artisans but the weapon of factories. And in total war between industrial powers, factories decide outcomes more certainly than aces, more reliably than tactics, more inexorably than courage. This is how 8 machine guns shattered certainty. Not through elegance, but through overwhelming, sustained, mathematically inevitable application of industrial force.